They laughed when the old man pulled out a ration card from 1944 until they saw the medal on his coat. The fluorescent lights of Morrison's family grocery hummed their monotonous tune on a Wednesday afternoon in late October 2024, casting their sterile glow across aisles packed with abundance most Americans had long taken for granted. The store was busy, as it always was around 3 o'clock, when the after-school crowd mixed with early bird retirees and harried parents grabbing ingredients for dinner. Shopping carts clattered across linoleum floors. The automated voice of the self-checkout stations repeated their instructions in that peculiarly cheerful, inhuman tone. Somewhere near the produce section, a child wailed for candy while a tired mother negotiated the terms of snack-time surrender. Nobody paid much attention when the old man shuffled through the automatic doors. He moved slowly, methodically, as if each step required careful consideration. His shoes, brown leather Oxfords that had seen better decades, made soft scuffing sounds against the floor. The soles were worn thin enough that you could probably feel every crack in the pavement outside, every imperfection in the tiles within. He wore a simple jacket, brown corduroy with patches at the elbows that someone had sewn with care and precision, though the thread didn't quite match the fabric anymore. Beneath it, a faded blue button-down shirt, carefully pressed despite its age, was tucked into dark slacks held up by a braided leather belt with a tarnished brass buckle. His face told the story of 9 decades lived fully. Deep lines carved paths from the corners of his eyes. Crow's feet, earned from years of squinting into harsh light, perhaps desert sun or the glare off ocean waters. His skin had that papery quality that comes with advanced age, spotted with the marks time leaves on all of us if we're lucky enough to survive long enough to collect them. Wisps of white hair, combed neatly to one side in a style that hadn't changed since Eisenhower was president, capped a head that tilted slightly forward as he walked, as if he was perpetually looking for something on the ground just ahead. But it was his eyes that would haunt anyone who looked closely enough. Pale blue, faded like old denim left too long in the sun, they held something that contradicted his shabby appearance, a clarity, a sharpness, an awareness that seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. He carried no shopping list. He didn't pull out his phone to check an app or consult a carefully curated digital shopping cart. Instead, he moved through the store with the patience of someone who remembered when shopping meant knowing the grocer by name, when there were no scanners or barcodes, when you asked for what you needed and someone fetched it from behind the counter, the bread aisle first. His weathered hand, marked with age spots and the small scars of a lifetime, reached for a simple loaf of white bread. Wonder bread, the kind with the cheerful colored balloons on the wrapper. Not the artisanal sourdough or the multigrain with ancient seeds that cost $7. The cheapest loaf on the shelf, marked down because it would expire in 2 days. He held it carefully, as if it were precious, and placed it in the red plastic shopping basket he'd taken at the entrance. Next, he made his way to the canned goods section. The basket grew heavier as he added items one by one. A can of Campbell's condensed tomato soup, 2 cans of tuna fish, a can of green beans, a small can of coffee, Folgers, not the premium brands. Each selection was deliberate. Each price tag was checked carefully, his lips moving slightly as he calculated numbers in his head, the way people did before calculators became commonplace, before everyone carried a computer in their pocket. A teenage girl in yoga pants and a college sweatshirt nearly collided with him as she rushed past, scrolling through her phone with one hand while pushing her cart with the other. She didn't apologize, didn't even seem to notice she'd almost knocked the old man off balance. He steadied himself against the shelf, waiting for the wave of dizziness to pass, then continued his slow progression through the store. Near the dairy section, he paused for a long moment in front of the milk. His hand reached out, touched the cold plastic of a gallon jug, then pulled back. Too much, perhaps. Too expensive, too heavy to carry. Instead, He selected a single pint of whole milk, the kind that came in a small paper carton with a peaked top that had to be unfolded to pour. Old-fashioned, inefficient, exactly what someone of his generation would recognize and trust. The basket wasn't full, but it was enough. Bread, canned goods, coffee, milk, and one small luxury, a single Hershey's chocolate bar, the plain kind with the silver wrapper. He held that chocolate bar for almost a minute before placing it in the basket, and if you'd been watching closely, you might have seen something shift in his expression. A memory, perhaps, of when chocolate was a rare treat, when it was rationed and precious, when a single bar could mean the difference between despair and hope. By the time he reached the checkout lanes, a line had formed at each register. The self-checkout stations beeped and flashed to his left, customers scanning their own items with varying degrees of success and frustration. He looked at those machines the way someone might look at an alien artifact, with recognition that they served a purpose, but no real understanding of or desire to engage with them. Instead, he moved to the traditional checkout lane, the one marked Lane 3, where a young woman with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail stood behind the register, her name tag identifying her as Kaylee. She couldn't have been more than 22, her face still holding that smooth, untroubled quality of someone who hadn't yet accumulated the weight of real hardship. She wore the store's uniform, a teal polo shirt with the Morrison's logo embroidered on the chest, and she had her phone on the counter beside the register, screen down, but clearly within reach for when business was slow. The man ahead of him in line had a cart overflowing with groceries, the weekly haul for a family probably. Cases of soda, multiple boxes of cereal, steaks wrapped in cellophane, a shocking abundance that would have fed a family for weeks in another era. Kaylee scanned item after item, the register beeping its staccato rhythm, while the customer tapped his credit card against the payment terminal without even looking, his attention on his phone. "Have a good day," Kaylee said automatically as the man walked away, and the words sounded like they'd been said 1,000 times before without any real meaning attached. Then it was the old man's turn. He set his red plastic basket on the counter with both hands, carefully, as if it were fragile. The items inside shifted slightly, the cans making a soft metallic sound against each other. "Hi there," Kaylee said with practiced cheerfulness, already reaching for the first item. "How are you today?" "Well enough, miss," the old man replied, and his voice was surprising. Not weak or quavering as you might expect from someone his age, but clear and measured, with an underlying authority that seemed at odds with his shabby appearance. There was something almost formal about the way he spoke, as if he'd been trained in proper diction, in the importance of enunciation and respect. Kaylee scanned the bread. Beep, the tomato soup. Beep, the tuna. Beep, beep, the green beans. Beep, the coffee. Beep, the milk. Beep, the chocolate bar. Beep. "That'll be 1847, she said, and the register displayed the numbers in bright green LED, 1847. The old man nodded slowly, as if he'd expected something close to that amount. His hand moved to the inside pocket of his corduroy jacket, fingers disappearing into the fabric with the careful precision of someone retrieving something valuable. What he pulled out made Kaylee's smile falter. It wasn't a wallet, it wasn't a phone with a digital payment app, it wasn't even cash. It was a small booklet, no bigger than a passport, with a cover that had once been tan but had faded to a yellowish brown over the decades. The edges were soft and worn, the corners rounded from years of being carried in pockets and purses. The paper had that brittle quality of documents from another era, before acid-free archival materials became standard, when things were made to serve their purpose and then fade away, not to last forever. On the cover, in faded black lettering, were the words, "War Ration Book 4. Below that, smaller, United States of America. Below that, smaller still, Office of Price Administration." The old man placed it carefully on the counter between them, his weathered fingers resting on top of it for just a moment, before sliding it toward Kaylee. She stared at it. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. Her eyes flicked from the booklet to the old man's face, searching for some explanation, some sign that this was a joke. "I'm sorry," she said finally, that customer service smile returning but with an uncertain quality now. "What is this?" "My ration book," the old man replied simply, as if this explained everything. His finger, gnarled with arthritis, pointed to the stamps inside, little squares in various colors, some torn out, some still intact. "I have stamps for coffee here, see? And this one's for meat, though I know the tuna isn't quite meat in the traditional sense. And sugar stamps. Those should cover the chocolate, I'd think." Kaylee's eyes went wide. Behind the old man, the person in line, a middle-aged woman in business casual, clearly on her break from some office job, leaned to the side to see what was causing the delay. Her expression shifted from impatient to confused. "Sir," Kaylee said, her voice gentler now, the tone people use when speaking to children or when they suspect they might be dealing with someone who's not quite present. This is really old. We can't accept this. We need, cash or a card." The old man's expression didn't change. He simply looked at her with those pale blue eyes that had seen things this young woman couldn't imagine. "This was valid currency," he said quietly. "This is how we paid during the war. Each stamp had value. Each stamp represented sacrifice." A line was forming now. The woman behind him sighed audibly and checked her watch. Behind her, a younger man in construction clothes craned his neck to see what was happening. Someone else pulled out their phone. Kaylee's cheeks flushed pink. She looked around helplessly, as if the store itself might provide guidance. The automated voice of the self-checkout continued its mechanical instructions nearby. "Please place your item in the bagging area." The normal sounds of commerce and modern life continued around them, indifferent to this strange moment unfolding at lane 3. "I'm really sorry, sir," Kaylee said, and she did sound genuinely sorry, genuinely uncomfortable. "But I need to call my manager. I can't accept this." The old man nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. "Of course," he said. "Call your manager." Kaylee pressed a button on her register, and somewhere in the back offices of Morrison's family grocery, a light blinked and a notification appeared on a screen. Then she picked up the phone beside her register, pressed a few numbers, and spoke in a voice just loud enough to be heard. "Hey, Mr. Patterson, I need you at lane 3. There's a situation." The word hung in the air. Situation. The woman in business casual made an exasperated sound and moved to another line. The construction worker stayed, but he pulled out his phone and angled it slightly toward the register. Others in the growing line behind them began to whisper. An older gentleman in the next lane over looked up from his own transaction, something in his posture changing, becoming alert. The old man stood perfectly still, his hands resting on the counter now, his worn shoes planted firmly on the floor. His posture, despite his age, despite the cheap clothes and the shuffling walk, was somehow impeccable. Spine straight, shoulders back, head level. There was something in the way he stood there, not defiant exactly, but unshakable, that suggested this wasn't confusion. This wasn't senility or poverty or desperation. This was something else entirely. A young mother holding a toddler's hand moved closer, curious. A teenager in a Morrison's uniform stopped restocking shelves to watch. The store's ambient noise seemed to dim somehow. Or perhaps it was just that everyone's attention was beginning to focus on lane 3, on the old man with the ration book, on whatever was about to unfold. Kaylee shifted her weight from foot to foot, her discomfort visible in every movement. She glanced at the old man, then away, then back again. "He'll be here in just a minute, sir," she said softly. "Take your time, miss," the old man replied. "I've gotten good at waiting in my long life. Waited in lines for food, waited in foxholes for dawn, waited on beaches for orders that would send boys younger than you into hell itself. I can wait a few minutes for a manager." Something in his voice when he said those words made Kaylee go very still, made several people in line stop their whispering, made the older gentleman in the next lane turn fully around to stare, because it wasn't the voice of a confused elderly man anymore. It wasn't the voice of someone broken by age or circumstances. It was the voice of someone who had commanded, someone who had led, someone who had made decisions that mattered. From the back of the store, hurried footsteps approached. Mr. Patterson was coming. And the old man stood there at the register, that ancient ration book on the counter before him, waiting with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that some lessons are worth whatever time they take to teach. But then someone in the crowd noticed something that would change everything in the moments to come. Because just visible at the edge of the old man's worn jacket, where the fabric had shifted when he reached for his ration book, was the glint of metal, a ribbon in colors that anyone who knew anything about military decorations would recognize instantly. Blue with 13 white stars, and below it, suspended on that ribbon, a 5-pointed star. But before anyone could speak, before anyone could ask, Mr. Patterson arrived at lane 3, his expression already settling into the tired professionalism of someone about to deal with what he assumed was just another difficult customer. He had no idea what he was walking into. Mr. Patterson was 43 years old, had managed Morrison's family grocery for 7 years, and prided himself on handling difficult situations efficiently. He dealt with shoplifters, angry customers, and every kind of retail crisis imaginable. He approached lane 3 with the confidence of a man who'd seen it all. He was about to discover he hadn't. "What seems to be the problem here?" Patterson asked, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and forced patience that retail managers perfect over years of mediating disputes. He was a thick-set man with a receding hairline, wearing the same teal polo as Kaylee, but with manager embroidered beneath the Morrison's logo. His glasses sat low on his nose, and he had the permanently tired eyes of someone who'd long ago accepted that grocery retail would be his career, not just a job. Kaylee gestured helplessly at the ration book still sitting on the counter. "He's trying to pay with—" "Do that," she said, her voice apologetic. Patterson picked up the booklet, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered across his face. Recognition, perhaps. His grandfather might have had one of these. But the flicker passed quickly, replaced by professional concern. "Sir," Patterson said, setting the ration book back down and addressing the old man with exaggerated clarity, speaking slightly louder than necessary, the way people often do when they assume age equals deafness or diminished capacity. "This is a historical document. It's not valid currency. I'm going to need you to pay with cash, credit, or debit." The old man looked at Patterson directly, those pale blue eyes steady and unwavering. "I understand what you need, son," he said quietly, "but this is what I have to offer today." Patterson's jaw tightened. The line behind the old man had grown to 7 people now, and he could feel their impatience like a physical pressure. Time was money. Every minute spent on this situation was a minute of customer frustration, potential complaints, bad reviews online. "Sir, I appreciate that this might be confusing," Patterson said, his voice taking on that condescending edge that people use when they think they're being kind but are actually being dismissive. "But we can't accept this. This was used during World War II for rationing. The war ended almost 80 years ago. Do you understand?" "I understand perfectly well," the old man replied. His voice remained calm, measured, but something had shifted in his bearing. His spine somehow straightened even more. "I understand that during that war, every American did their part, that families at home gave up meat and sugar and coffee so that soldiers could eat, that these stamps represented sacrifice, real sacrifice." Behind him, someone in line muttered, "Oh, for God's sake!" Another voice, younger, "Can we get another register open?" A woman's voice, sharp with irritation, "I've got to pick up my kids in 20 minutes. The construction worker was definitely filming now, his phone held at chest level, trying to be subtle, but failing. Others had their phones out too. In 2024, every conflict was potential content, every public interaction a possible viral moment. Patterson felt the situation slipping away from him. He needed to resolve this quickly. "Sir," he said, his patience wearing visibly thin, "I'm going to have to ask you to either pay with accepted currency or leave the store. I'm sorry, but those are your options." "Is he homeless?" someone whispered behind them, not quietly enough. "Probably confused," another voice replied. "My grandmother got like that toward the end. Thought it was still the 1950s. "Sad, really," a third voice added, dripping with pity that somehow felt worse than mockery. The old man heard every word. Of course he heard them. And something in his expression suggested he'd expected exactly this response. Kaylee shifted uncomfortably, her face flushed red now. "Mr. Patterson," she said softly, "maybe we could just—" "No," Patterson cut her off. He turned back to the old man. "Sir, I need you to make a decision. Pay properly or leave." The old man reached into his other pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a worn leather wallet. It was old, cracked, held together more by habit than by the integrity of the leather itself. He opened it, and inside were $3 bills. 3 singles. "This is what I have," he said simply. $3 in your modern currency. And these stamps from when America understood the meaning of sacrifice. Patterson pinched the bridge of his nose. "That's not enough to cover 1847. "I know. And you can't purchase these items." "I understand. So you need to leave." The moment hung there, suspended. The fluorescent lights hummed. The self-checkout stations beeped their automated symphony. Life continued everywhere else, normal and mundane, while here at Lane 3, something fundamental was being tested. The woman who'd mentioned picking up her kids stepped out of line with an exaggerated sigh. "This is ridiculous," she announced as she headed to another register. 2 others followed her, shaking their heads. But some stayed. The construction worker kept filming. An elderly man in the next lane had abandoned his own transaction entirely and was watching intently, his weathered hands gripping his shopping cart with white knuckles. A woman in her 60s, wearing a windbreaker with a VFW post number embroidered on the chest, had moved closer, her expression troubled. And a young man, maybe 30, with a high and tight haircut and a bearing that suggested military service, had stopped in the middle of the aisle, his attention completely focused on the old man at the register. "Maybe someone could help him," a voice suggested from the back of the line. It was an older woman, her hair silver, her face kind. "I could pay for his groceries. It's only $18. The suggestion hung in the air, seemingly generous, but carrying with it all the weight of charity given to those deemed unable to care for themselves. The old man turned slightly, enough to acknowledge the woman. "Thank you, ma'am. That's very kind, but I must respectfully decline." "Oh, don't be proud," the woman said, her kindness edging into insistence. "It's no trouble at all. Let me just—" "Ma'am," the old man interrupted, and something in his tone made her stop. "I appreciate the gesture more than you know, but this isn't about the money." "Then what's it about?" Patterson demanded, his frustration now fully visible. "Because I've got a store to run and customers to serve, and you're holding up the line with some kind of—" He gestured vaguely at the ration book. "Whatever this is." "This," the old man said quietly, picking up the ration book and holding it so everyone could see it clearly, "is a reminder. This represents a time when every American made sacrifices for something bigger than themselves." And he opened the booklet carefully. The pages inside were yellowed and delicate, covered in stamps, some cut out carefully along perforated lines, others still intact. Red stamps, blue stamps, green stamps. "This book belonged to my wife, Margaret," he continued, his voice steady despite the humiliation of the moment, despite the phones recording him, despite the whispers. "She used these stamps during the war while I was overseas. She stood in line at stores, not so different from this one, waiting her turn to buy whatever rationed goods she was allowed. Sometimes there wasn't enough, even with the stamps. But she never complained. None of them did. Kaylee's eyes were wet now, though she seemed to be fighting against tears. Patterson's expression had shifted to something harder to read. Discomfort, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding that this was more complicated than he'd thought. "That's a nice story, sir," Patterson said, attempting sympathy but landing closer to patronizing. "But it doesn't change the fact that we can't accept this as payment." "I heard you the first time," the old man said, and for just a second something flashed in his eyes. Not anger exactly, but something that suggested anger was available to him if he chose to access it. "I understand perfectly well what you need from me. What I'm trying to determine is whether anyone here understands what was given for them." "Oh, give me a break," someone in line muttered. "We all respect veterans, but this is a grocery store, not a history lesson." The young man with the military haircut took a step forward. "Hey," he said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Show some respect." "For what?" the first voice shot back. "Some old guy who can't figure out how money works?" "That's enough," the young man said, his voice harder now. He set down his bag of dog food and moved closer to lane 3. His eyes had found something, zeroing in on the old man with an intensity that suggested recognition. "Sir," he addressed the old man directly, "did you serve?" The old man turned to look at the younger veteran. For a long moment they simply regarded each other, two men separated by generations, but connected by something civilians would never fully understand. "I did," the old man said simply. "Branch?" "Army." "When?" 1942 to 1945, then Korea, and Vietnam as an observer." The young man's eyes widened. Sir, that's 3 wars." "3 wars," the old man confirmed. "Though the first one is the only one that truly matters for today's purpose." The young veteran's attention shifted, scanning the old man's appearance more carefully now. The worn jacket, the pressed shirt beneath, the way he stood, ramrod straight despite his age. And then, as the jacket shifted slightly, the younger man saw it. The ribbon, blue with white stars. His face went pale. "Sir," he said, his voice dropping to something approaching reverence. "Is that—" But Patterson, oblivious to what was unfolding, interrupted. "Look, I'm sorry about your service, and we all appreciate it. But this isn't about respect or history. This is about store policy. You can't pay with that ration book, period. So I'm going to have to ask you one more time to either pay with real money or leave." "Real money," the old man repeated softly. "You want to know about real money, son? Real money is what my men paid on beaches in Normandy. Real money is what boys paid when they jumped out of planes into darkness. That's real money. What you're asking me for is just paper and plastic." The store had gone quiet now. "This ration book," he continued, holding it up, "represents a time when everyone understood that some things cost more than dollars and cents." Patterson looked trapped between sympathy and procedure. "Sir, I truly am sorry, but I have to enforce store policy." "Everyone has choices," the old man said. "I'm choosing to stand here and see what choices other people make." "That's great, Grandpa," a teenage boy said from the crowd, his voice dripping with casual cruelty. "Very inspiring. But some of us have lives to live, so maybe take your history lesson somewhere else." Laughter rippled through parts of the crowd. Not everyone. Some people looked uncomfortable, but enough. The old man carefully placed the ration book back in his jacket pocket. His $3 bills he folded and returned to his wallet. He looked at the groceries on the counter, and something flickered across his face. Sadness, perhaps, or the weariness of someone who'd lived long enough to see the world forget. "I apologize for the inconvenience," he said to Kaylee. The young cashier looked like she might cry. He turned to leave. And that's when the woman in the VFW jacket spoke up, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Wait," she said, stepping forward. Her eyes were fixed on the old man's jacket, on the spot where the fabric had shifted. "Sir, what's on your jacket? That ribbon?" The old man paused. "Just an old medal, ma'am." "What kind of medal?" He seemed to consider whether to answer. The store was silent now, everyone waiting. "The kind," the old man said slowly, "that you hope you never have to earn." The young veteran pushed forward through the crowd. "Sir, please," he said. "Show them." The old man looked at him for a long moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, he reached up and unbuttoned his corduroy jacket. What everyone saw changed everything. There, pinned carefully to the inside of his jacket where they wouldn't show, where they would remain private and humble, were medals. Not just one or two. These were the medals that made other veterans step back in awe. At the top, unmistakable in its distinctive blue ribbon with 13 white stars, was the Medal of Honor. Below it, the Distinguished Service Cross, the silver star with oak leaf clusters, the bronze star with V device for valor, 2 purple hearts, campaign ribbons for Normandy, the bulge, the Presidential Unit citation. More decorations, more evidence of a life spent in service beyond comprehension. The construction worker's phone captured it all. The young veteran stood at attention without realizing he'd done so. The woman in the VFW jacket brought her hand to her mouth. Patterson's face went white. Kaylee whispered, "Oh my God." Someone in the crowd said quietly, "Holy shit." And the old man stood there with his jacket open, revealing a lifetime of heroism they'd had no idea existed. "That's," the young veteran's voice cracked. "Sir, that's the Medal of Honor." "It is," the old man confirmed quietly. The teenager who'd mocked him moments before had gone silent, his face ashen. The woman who'd left the line in frustration had stopped halfway to the other register, frozen. The entire store seemed to hold its breath, because they'd just realized who they'd been mocking, who they'd dismissed, who they'd laughed at and judged and found wanting. And the shame of that realization was written on every face. The silence that followed the revelation was unlike any silence Morrison's family grocery had ever known. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of a slow afternoon or the brief lull between customer rushes. This was the silence of collective shame, of sudden understanding, of a crowd realizing they'd judged a book by its tattered cover and found themselves catastrophically wrong. The old man stood there, his corduroy jacket still unbuttoned, the array of medals visible to everyone who cared to look. The fluorescent lights caught the metal and ribbons, making them gleam against the faded fabric of his shirt. Each decoration told a story. Each ribbon represented blood and sacrifice, and moments when death had come close enough to whisper in his ear. The young veteran with the high and tight haircut was the first to break the silence. His hand came up in a crisp salute, his body rigid at attention, his face a mixture of awe and something approaching reverence. "Sir," he said, his voice thick with emotion, we didn't know." The old man looked at him kindly and returned the salute with the practiced precision of someone who'd done it 10,000 times. "At ease, son," he said gently. "You couldn't have known. That was rather the point." "What's your name, sir?" the young veteran asked. "Please." The old man hesitated. His weathered hand moved to button his jacket again, as if he regretted revealing what he'd spent a lifetime keeping private. But before he could answer, the woman in the VFW windbreaker stepped closer, her eyes scanning the medals with the knowledge of someone who understood military decorations. "The Medal of Honor," she breathed, "the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 purple hearts." She looked up at his face, tears streaming down her cheeks now. "My husband served in Vietnam. He used to tell me about men like you. The ones who did things that the rest of us can't even imagine. The ones who came home and never spoke about it because the memories were too heavy to share." The old man's expression softened. "Your husband sounds like a good man, ma'am." "He was," she said. "He died 3 years ago, cancer from Agent Orange exposure." She wiped her eyes. "He would have been honored to stand in your presence." "Nah, the honor would have been mine," the old man replied, and the way he said it made clear he meant every word. Patterson stood frozen behind the register, his face a mask of horror as the full weight of what he'd done, what he'd almost done, crashed over him. He'd been seconds away from calling security, from having this man physically removed from the store. This man who'd earned the nation's highest military decoration. This man who represented everything Patterson claimed to respect every 4th of July and Veterans Day when he posted patriotic memes on social media. "Sir," Patterson managed, his voice barely above a whisper, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize because I didn't want you to," the old man said, not unkindly. "I dressed this way deliberately. I came in here looking like just another struggling old man because I wanted to see something." "See what?" Kaylee asked. She'd come around from behind the register, no longer concerned with protocols or procedures, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. The old man looked at her, at Patterson, at the crowd that had gathered. More people had arrived now, drawn by the commotion, by the phones recording, by the sense that something significant was happening. The other registers had slowed or stopped entirely as employees and customers alike turned their attention to Lane 3. "I wanted to see," the old man said slowly, carefully, "how we treat our elders when we think they have nothing left to offer. How we treat our veterans when we don't know they're veterans. How we treat the confused, the struggling, the seemingly worthless members of our society." His words landed like hammer blows. "My wife, Margaret, died 6 months ago," he continued, his voice steady despite the pain the words clearly carried. "We were married for 68 years. She was my whole world. When she passed, something broke in me. I've found myself confused sometimes, living in the past. The past feels more real than the present some days." He pulled the ration book back out of his jacket pocket, holding it with infinite gentleness. This was hers. She saved it all these years. Every time I look at it, I remember what it was like, what we all went through, what we gave up so that future generations, your generation, could have everything you have now. A woman in her 40s, wearing yoga pants and carrying a purse that probably cost more than the old man's entire outfit, had her hand over her mouth, tears running freely. The construction worker had lowered his phone, no longer interested in content, but in simply bearing witness. "I've been to stores like this a dozen times in the past few months," the old man said. "Sometimes I'm clear-headed and I pay with my debit card like everyone else. Sometimes I'm lost in memories and I do things that don't make sense. And I've watched how people react, how patience has become a rare commodity, how we've lost the ability to see past appearances." The teenage boy who'd mocked him earlier looked like he wanted to disappear through the floor. His face was red, his eyes downcast, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. "But this time," the old man continued, "this time I did it on purpose. I came here clear-headed and clear-eyed, dressed like this, carrying that ration book, because I wanted to conduct a test of humanity, of dignity, of whether we still remember that every person you meet might be carrying a story you can't imagine." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I've led men into battle," he said quietly. "I've made decisions that sent young men to their deaths. I've held boys as they bled out in my arms, crying for mothers they'd never see again. I've earned decorations for actions that still wake me up screaming 50 years later. But none of that matters when you're just an old man in shabby clothes trying to buy bread and soup." Patterson's face had gone from white to grey. "Sir, there's no excuse for how we treated you. No excuse at all." "You're right," the old man agreed. "There isn't, but I'm not looking for excuses. I'm looking for lessons learned." The elderly man from the next register had slowly made his way over, leaning heavily on a cane. He was perhaps the same age as the decorated veteran, his face similarly lined with decades of living. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of understanding. "I know you," he said, staring at the old man's face. "I've seen your picture. You're James Collier, Major General James Collier. You led the assault on—" He stopped, his voice breaking. "My brother served under you in France. He didn't make it home, but he wrote to us about you, about how you refused to leave wounded men behind, about how you led from the front." not from some safe command post. The name rippled through the crowd. Some people pulled out their phones, not to record now, but to search, to verify, to learn. Within seconds, Wikipedia entries and Medal of Honor citations were being read, shared, whispered about. James Collier, Major General, Medal of Honor recipient for actions on D-Day, where he'd single-handedly silenced a German bunker that was slaughtering American soldiers as they came ashore. Distinguished Service Cross for actions during the Battle of the Bulge. 2 Purple Hearts for wounds that would have sent most men home, but that he'd recovered from just enough to return to his unit. A legend. A genuine American hero. A name that belonged in history books. And they'd treated him like trash. "Your brother's name?" General Collier asked the elderly man gently. "Richard Porter, Private First Class. He died near St. Lo in July of '44. General Collier closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they were wet. "I remember Richard. Red hair, freckles, couldn't have been more than 19. He saved 3 men when his position got overrun. Held off the Germans long enough for his squad to retreat. We put him up for a Silver Star." The elderly man was crying now, openly and without shame. "We never knew the details. Just that he died a hero." "He was a hero," General Collier confirmed. "One of so many. Your brother represents everything good about that generation, about what we were willing to sacrifice." He turned back to the crowd, to Patterson, to Cayley, to all the people who'd witnessed this scene. "Richard Porter died at 19, he said. "He never got to finish high school, never got to marry, never got to have children or grandchildren. He gave up everything, his entire future, so that you could stand here in this store with shelves full of food that nobody has to ration, so that you could have the freedom to mock an old man for not understanding your modern payment systems." The words weren't delivered with anger. Somehow that made them cut deeper. "I'm not angry," General Collier continued. "I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed that we've built a society where patience is seen as weakness, where the elderly are treated as burdens, where veterans are thanked for their service with empty words, but not with the simple dignity of basic human respect." A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped forward. He looked like he'd come from some office job, probably stopped in on his way home. "Sir," he said, his voice formal, respectful, "I served, Marines, Iraq, and I'm ashamed. We were taught to respect our elders, especially veterans. What happened here today," he trailed off, unable to finish. "What happened here today," General Collier said, "is what happens everywhere, every day. Good people making quick judgments, busy people with no time for inconvenience. A society that's forgotten how to slow down and see the humanity in everyone they meet." He looked down at his groceries, still sitting on the counter, where Cayley had scanned them. The bread, the soup, the tuna, the coffee, the milk, the chocolate bar, $18.47 worth of basic necessities. "I can pay for these," he said, pulling out his wallet again. But this time, when he opened it, people could see it wasn't just $3 inside. There were credit cards, a debit card, a military ID that identified him as a retired general. Everything he needed to pay the normal way. "I've always been able to pay," he said. "This was never about the money. This was about the lesson." He pulled out a $20 bill and placed it on the counter. Cayley picked it up with trembling hands and processed the transaction, her face streaked with tears. The register made its familiar sounds, the drawer opening, change being counted, but everyone watched in silence. "Keep the change," General Collier said, as Cayley tried to hand him his $53. "Sir, I can't." "Yes, you can," he said gently. "You showed discomfort with what was happening. That's more than most people managed. That deserves recognition." He began placing his items back in the red plastic basket, moving with the same careful deliberation he'd shown throughout this entire ordeal. The young veteran immediately stepped forward. "Sir, let me carry that for you." "Please." General Collier looked at him and smiled. It was the first real smile anyone had seen from him, and it transformed his face, made him look years younger. "That's kind of you, son. What's your name?" "Captain Marcus Webb, sir, Army Rangers. 2 tours in Afghanistan." "Rangers lead the way," General Collier said, the old motto coming automatically. "All the way, sir," Webb replied, his voice choking up. "You can walk me to my car, Captain," General Collier said. "I'd be honored by the company." As they prepared to leave, the crowd remained silent, but it was a different silence now. Not the silence of judgment or impatience, but the silence of people confronting their own failings, of people realizing they'd been given a lesson they'd never forget. Patterson found his voice. "Sir, before you go, please, let me apologize properly, on behalf of Morrison's, on behalf of myself, on behalf of apology accepted," General Collier said simply. "But actions matter more than words, Mr. Patterson. How will you treat the next confused elderly person who comes through your store? That's the question that matters." He began walking toward the exit, Captain Webb at his side carrying the basket. But before they reached the door, General Collier stopped and turned back one final time. "There's one more thing you should know," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent store. "About why I carry Margaret's ration book, about what it really means to me." The crowd leaned in, waiting. "But that," he said, "is a story for those who truly want to understand what was sacrificed for the freedom you enjoy every single day." And with that, Major General James Collier, Medal of Honor recipient, decorated war hero, and humble teacher of humanity's most important lessons, walked toward the exit. But his story, and his final, most powerful message, was far from over. The automatic doors of Morrison's family grocery opened with their familiar whoosh, but Major General James Collier paused in the threshold, his worn shoes planted on the rubber mat that triggered the sensor. Captain Marcus Webb stood beside him, the red plastic basket still in his hands, waiting with the patience of a soldier who understood that some moments couldn't be rushed. Behind them, the crowd hadn't dispersed. If anything, more people had gathered, employees emerging from the back room, customers abandoning their shopping carts, everyone drawn by the gravity of what was unfolding. The young teenager who'd mocked the general stood frozen near the candy display, his face a portrait of shame. The woman who'd offered charity money clutched her purse with white knuckles. Patterson stood behind his register like a man awaiting judgment. General Collier turned back to face them all, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of authority that came not from rank, but from earned respect. "You want to know about this ration book," he said, pulling it once more from his jacket pocket. The yellowed pages caught the afternoon light streaming through the store's windows. "You want to know why a man with a military pension and full benefits would come into a store and try to pay with something from 1944. He moved back into the store, and the crowd instinctively parted, creating a path. He walked slowly back toward lane 3, toward Kaylee, who still stood at her register, toward the scene of his humiliation that had become something else entirely. A classroom, perhaps, where the most important lessons were being taught. "Margaret Ann Collier," he said, opening the ration book to the first page, where a name was written in careful, feminine handwriting that had faded but remained legible. "Born 1925. Died April 18th, 2024. My wife. My partner. The woman who saved my life more times than I can count, and she never fired a single shot." He traced the signature with his finger, the gesture so tender that several people in the crowd wiped their eyes. "When I shipped out in 1942, I was 20 years old," General Collier continued. "A farm boy from Iowa who'd never been more than 50 miles from home. I thought I understood sacrifice because I'd grown up during the Depression. We'd been poor, but we'd never gone hungry. I thought I knew what hardship meant." He paused, looking at the faces watching him, young and old, some understanding, some still learning. "I didn't know anything," he said quietly, "not until I saw what real war looked like." Not until I watched boys die in ways that no human being should ever die. Not until I had to make decisions that meant choosing which men lived and which men were sent into situations where survival was unlikely. The elderly man who'd recognized him, Richard Porter's brother, had tears streaming down his face. General Collier acknowledged him with a small nod before continuing. D-Day, he said, and the word itself seemed to carry weight. June 6, 1944, Omaha Beach. I was a first lieutenant then, leading a platoon. We were supposed to land at 6:30 a.m. Our landing craft got hit before we reached the beach. Half my men drowned before they ever saw combat, weighed down by their equipment, pulled under by the waves. The store was absolutely silent now. Even the hum of the refrigeration units seemed to fade into the background. Those of us who made it to shore found ourselves pinned down by German machine gun fire. Men were dying all around me. The sand was red with blood. The air smelled like gunpowder and death. And there was this bunker, a concrete fortification with a machine gun that had a clear field of fire across our section of beach. Every time someone tried to advance, that gun cut them down. He stopped, his eyes distant now, seeing something that happened 80 years ago but lived in his memory like it was yesterday. I watched that gun kill 37 men in the first 20 minutes, he said, his voice flat, emotionless in the way that comes from recounting trauma so often that the only way to survive it is to remove all feeling. 37 boys who'd never go home, who'd never marry or have children or grow old, 37 futures ended by German bullets. Captain Webb had set down the basket and stood at attention, his face reflecting the understanding of one veteran listening to another. So I did something stupid, General Collier said, something that should have gotten me killed but didn't. I gathered 4 men, the only ones close enough to hear me over the gunfire, and we worked our way up the beach, using the bodies of the dead for cover. I'm not proud of that. I'm not proud that we crawled over the corpses of our brothers. But it was the only way. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was harder, colder. We reached the bunker. I had 2 grenades left. I threw the first one through the gun slit. It bounced back out and exploded in front of the bunker, wounding one of my men. The second grenade I held for an extra second, long enough to cook it off so it couldn't be thrown back. And then I shoved it through the opening. The explosion, though it had happened decades ago, seemed to echo in the silence of the grocery store. The machine gun stopped, he said simply. My men advanced. We took the beach. And later, much later, someone wrote up what I'd done, and I received the Medal of Honor. They called me a hero. They said I'd saved countless lives. He looked down at the medal, visible through his unbuttoned jacket. But all I could think about were the 37 men who died before I acted. The 37 who would have lived if I'd been faster, smarter, braver. The 37 whose names I can still recite in order from memory. A woman in the crowd let out a sob. Patterson had his head in his hands. Kaylee was crying openly now, not bothering to wipe away the tears. I came home in 1945. General Collier continued, came home to Margaret, who I'd married right before shipping out. We'd had 3 days together as husband and wife before I left. 3 days. And then 4 years of war, because I went back for Korea and later Vietnam. He held up the ration book again. While I was fighting, Margaret was fighting her own war here at home. She worked in a factory making artillery shells, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. She stood in lines for rationed goods, sugar, coffee, meat, butter, gasoline. Everything was rationed, everything was scarce. But nobody complained because everyone understood we were in it together. He opened the book, showing the stamps inside. These blue stamps were for processed foods, red stamps for meat and dairy, green stamps for coffee and sugar. Every American family got a ration book. Rich or poor, it didn't matter. Everyone got the same allotment. Everyone made the same sacrifices. Doyle, his finger traced the stamps that had been carefully cut out. Margaret used stamp number 17 to buy coffee the day after she got the telegram telling her I'd been wounded the first time. Used stamp A8 to buy sugar to bake a cake the day she learned I'd survived the Battle of the Bulge. Used stamp T5 to buy meat to make a special dinner the day I finally came home. He looked up at the crowd, and his pale blue eyes were fierce now, burning with the intensity of someone who'd lived through hell and emerged with truths that needed to be shared. She kept this book for 79 years, he said. Through all our moves, all our deployments, all the years of my military career. She kept it because it reminded her of what sacrifice really means. Not the dramatic sacrifice of soldiers dying on battlefields, though that matters too, but the quiet, everyday sacrifice of millions of ordinary people doing their small part. He closed the book carefully and held it against his chest. When she died 6 months ago, his voice finally breaking, showing the raw grief beneath the military bearing. I found this book in her jewelry box, kept right next to her wedding ring and the letters I'd sent her from overseas, and I realized something. He paused, composing himself, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady once more. I realized that we've forgotten, he said. We've forgotten what it means to sacrifice for something bigger than ourselves. We've forgotten what it means to be patient with those who struggle. We've forgotten what it means to see the value in every human being, not just the ones who look successful or capable or worthy by our modern standards. General Collier walked slowly along the checkout lanes, and people instinctively reached out, not to touch him, but as if drawn by something they couldn't name. I've been coming to stores like this for months, he said, sometimes confused, sometimes clear-headed. And I've been conducting an experiment, testing to see if anyone would look past the shabby clothes and the odd behavior and see the human being beneath. Testing to see if anyone still understood that the confused elderly person holding up the line might be someone's decorated veteran, someone's beloved grandparent, someone who once did extraordinary things. He stopped in front of the teenager who'd called him Grandpa mockingly. "What's your name, son?" he asked, not unkindly. The boy looked like he wanted to disappear. "Tyler," he managed. "Tyler Henderson." "Tyler," General Collier said. "How old are you?" 17, sir." 17, the general repeated. "The same age Richard Porter was when he enlisted. The same age as so many of the boys I led into battle. Boys who died so that you could stand here in freedom and mock an old man." Tyler's face crumpled. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." "You didn't know," General Collier agreed. "And that's the problem. You didn't know, so you assumed. You assumed that someone who looks confused or acts strangely is worthy of mockery rather than compassion. You assumed that someone in shabby clothes has no value." The same, he placed his hand on Tyler's shoulder, and the gesture was surprisingly gentle. "I'm going to tell you something important, Tyler, and I want you to remember it for the rest of your life. Every single person you meet is carrying a story you know nothing about. The homeless veteran on the corner might have saved lives in combat. The confused elderly woman at the pharmacy might have been a brilliant scientist. The immigrant working minimum wage might have been a doctor in their home country. You never know who you're talking to." Tyler nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir." General Collier turned back to address the entire crowd. "This ration book," he said, holding it up one final time, "represents an America that understood sacrifice. An America where everyone contributed, where patience was a virtue, where we took care of our elderly and honored those who'd served." He looked directly at Patterson. "I didn't come here to humiliate anyone," he said. "I came here to teach a lesson, because in 6 months I'll be 91 years old. In 10 years, maybe 15 if I'm lucky, I'll be gone, and all the men and women of my generation will be gone. We're the last living connection to a time when this entire nation came together for a common cause, when everyone sacrificed, when a ration book meant something more than just an old piece of paper." He carefully placed the book back in his jacket pocket, next to his heart, next to the medals he'd earned in blood and pain and loss. "The question isn't whether you respect me now that you know who I am," he said. "The question is whether you'll show that same respect to the next elderly person who confuses you, the next veteran who seems lost, the next person who doesn't fit your expectations of how someone should look or act or pay for their groceries." The weight of his words settled over the crowd like a benediction. "Because that person," General Collier finished, "might be carrying their own ration book, their own story of sacrifice, their own history of service that you know nothing about. And they deserve your respect, not because of their decorations or their rank or their past achievements, but simply because they're human beings who've earned the dignity of being treated with patience and kindness." He turned to Captain Webb. "Now, son, if you wouldn't mind helping an old general to his car, I think I've said what I came here to say." But before they could leave, something remarkable happened. One by one, people in the crowd began to stand at attention, not just the veterans, everyone. Young and old, military and civilian, they stood straight and silent as Major General James Collier walked toward the exit for the second time. And this time, when he reached the doors, he stopped and faced them one last time. "Remember," he said simply, "just remember." Then he walked out into the afternoon sunlight, leaving behind a store full of people who would never forget the lesson he'd taught them. But the story wasn't over yet, because what happened next would ensure that General Collier's lesson reached far beyond the walls of Morrison's family grocery. The autumn sunlight felt warm on General Collier's face as he stepped into the parking lot of Morrison's family grocery. Captain Webb walked beside him, still carrying the modest basket of groceries, $18.47 worth of bread, soup, and memories. The afternoon air carried the scent of fallen leaves and that particular October smell that reminded old soldiers of campaigns fought in changing seasons. "My car's just over there," General Collier said, gesturing toward an older model Buick, its blue paint faded but well maintained. On the rear bumper was a license plate frame that read, "Purple Heart Recipient." As they walked, Webb noticed the general moved differently now, less of the shuffle he'd affected in the store, more of the military bearing that decades of service had ingrained in his muscle memory. "Sir," Webb said quietly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, Captain." Why put yourself through that humiliation? You could walk into any store in America and be treated with respect. Why subject yourself to that?" General Collier stopped beside his car and turned to face the younger veteran. His pale blue eyes held a sadness that went beyond the grief of losing his wife. "Because respect that comes from knowledge of my decorations isn't real respect, son," he said. "It's recognition of achievement. But respect, true respect, is what you show someone when you don't know anything about them except that they're human beings who deserve dignity." He unlocked the car, and Webb placed the groceries carefully in the back seat. "After Margaret died," the general continued, his voice softening with pain still fresh, "I found myself getting confused sometimes, genuinely confused. I'd wake up and forget what year it was. The grief and the age, and maybe the beginning of dementia. They'd all combine and I'd slip back to 1944. He pulled out the ration book again, holding it like the precious artifact it was. "One day, I went to a pharmacy completely convinced this was the right way to pay. The pharmacist was patient with me. She treated me with kindness, even though I was clearly confused. And as I drove home, after the fog cleared, I thought about how easily that could have gone differently. Behind them, the automatic doors opened repeatedly as people emerged, not to leave, but to watch from a respectful distance. Patterson was there, and Kaylee and the woman in the VFW jacket. The elderly brother of Private Richard Porter stood with them, leaning on his cane. Even young Tyler had followed. "So, I decided to conduct an experiment," General Collier continued. "I dressed in my oldest clothes. I went to different stores. Sometimes I genuinely got confused. Other times, like today, I did it deliberately. I wanted to see how people would treat someone who appeared to have nothing, someone who seemed confused or poor or mentally unstable. And what did you find, sir? General Collier's expression was somber. I found that we've lost something essential. We've lost the ability to slow down, to be patient, to extend grace to people who don't fit our expectations. I've been mocked, dismissed, offered condescending charity. Only twice before today did anyone show me genuine kindness without knowing who I was. The weight of that statistic hung in the air. But today you revealed yourself, Webb said. Doesn't that undermine the lesson? I realize something, Captain. The lesson isn't complete until they understand the full cost of their dismissal, until they feel the shame of realizing they mistreated someone worthy of honor. Because maybe that shame will stay with them. Maybe the next time they encounter a confused elderly person, they'll remember this moment and wonder, what if this person has a story I can't see? He paused. And maybe eventually they'll realize you don't need to be a decorated general to deserve basic human dignity, that everyone has a story, that everyone deserves patience and kindness. Webb nodded slowly. It's a hell of a lesson, sir. It's the last lesson I have left to teach, General Collier said quietly. I'm 90 years old. I've survived 3 wars and outlived most of my friends. I don't have many years left. But I can use whatever time I have to remind people what we're losing, what we've forgotten. General Collier began walking toward the crowd that had gathered. As they approached, Patterson stepped forward first, his face still carrying the weight of guilt. "Sir," he said, his voice trembling, "I need to apologize properly. What happened in there, how I treated you, there's no excuse. None. I should have been patient. I should have been kind. Mr. Patterson, I accept your apology, but more importantly, what will you do differently next time?" Patterson took a deep breath. "Next time an elderly customer seems confused, I'll be patient. I'll offer help instead of frustration. I'll remember that every person has a story I don't know. I'll treat them the way I should treat everyone." "That's all I ask," General Collier said. He turned to the broader crowd. "Not that you treat decorated generals with respect, that's easy, but that you treat everyone with dignity. The homeless veteran on the corner, the confused elderly woman at the pharmacy, the immigrant struggling at the register, every single person." Kaylee stepped forward, tears still on her cheeks. "Sir, I'm so sorry. I felt uncomfortable the whole time, but I didn't speak up." "You showed compassion in your eyes," General Collier said gently. "You were uncomfortable because your conscience was telling you this wasn't right. Listen to that voice. Let it guide you to action." The woman in the VFW jacket approached. "General Collier, I volunteer at the Veterans Home now since my husband passed. And I promise you, sir, I will remember this day every single time I walk through those doors. Every veteran I meet will be treated with the dignity they deserve." "Your husband would be proud of you," General Collier said. Tyler, the teenage boy, approached last, unable to meet the general's eyes at first. "Sir," he managed, "I don't know how to apologize enough. What I said was cruel and stupid, and I've never felt worse about anything." General Collier put his hand on Tyler's shoulder. "Tyler, you're 17. You made a mistake. But you know what separates a good man from a bad one? A good man learns from his mistakes. You remember how you feel right now, and you let it guide you to be better. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir," Tyler said, finally meeting his eyes. "I promise. I'll never forget this." "Good. Then something positive has come from this day." The construction worker who'd been filming stepped forward. "Sir, I recorded what happened. I thought it would make good content, but now maybe people need to see this, need to learn this lesson." "What's your name, son?" "David Martinez, sir." "David, if you choose to share what happened today, make sure the lesson comes through. Not just the shame and revelation, but the core message, that every person deserves dignity, that we need to slow down and be patient. That sacrifice means putting others before ourselves. Can you do that?" "Yes, sir. I'll do it right, I promise." General Collier addressed the entire crowd one final time. I'm going to tell you one more thing about sacrifice, about what this ration book really means. He opened to a page where Margaret's signature appeared next to a stamped date, July 15th, 1944. On this date, Margaret used her sugar ration to bake a cake, not for herself. She baked it and took it to a neighbor, a woman whose son had just been killed in France. She used her precious sugar ration to bring comfort to someone suffering. That's what sacrifice looks like. That's what community looks like. He looked up from the book. We live in an age of abundance. You can walk into that store and buy anything you want. You don't wait in lines for rationed goods, and that's good. That's what we fought for. But somewhere along the way, we lost something. We lost the understanding that we're all in this together, that the person next to you might be struggling, that patience and kindness cost you nothing but mean everything to someone who's suffering. Richard Porter's brother spoke up, his voice wavering but strong. My brother didn't die so people could mock confused old men in grocery stores. He died believing in an America that took care of its own. He did, General Collier confirmed, and so did hundreds of thousands of others who never came home. They died believing the America they left behind would become something worthy of their sacrifice. They died believing future generations would remember, would honor, would live up to the ideals they fought for. He held the ration book against his chest. This isn't just paper. This is a covenant, a promise between the generation that sacrificed and the generations that benefit. The promise is simple. Remember, honor. Carry forward the lessons of service and sacrifice and community. The parking lot was absolutely silent. I'm an old man, General Collier said softly. I've lived longer than I ever expected. Longer than the boys who died on Omaha Beach. I've had 79 years they never got. A wife, a career, children and grandchildren. And now, at the end of that long life, I'm trying to use whatever time I have left to remind people of something essential. He looked at each person in turn. You never know who you're talking to. The shabby old man might be a general, or a private who served with honor, or a civilian who sacrificed in other ways, or just an old man who's confused and scared and alone. And every single one deserves your patience, your kindness, your respect, Webb spoke up. Sir, I want to make a commitment. I'm going to start volunteering at the VA hospital. I'm going to spend time with veterans who have no one else. And I'm going to teach my children, when I have them someday, about men like you. About what sacrifice really means. That's good, Captain. That's very good. Patterson stepped forward. Morrison's is going to make changes too. We're implementing training for all employees about treating elderly and confused customers with dignity. We're creating a quiet hour for customers who get overwhelmed. We're going to do better. Now that is how you turn shame into positive action. I'm proud of you, Mr. Patterson. Before the general could turn toward his car, the elderly brother of Richard Porter spoke. General Collier, would you tell me something about my brother? Something I might not know. General Collier's face softened. He thought for a moment, sorting through decades of memories. Richard had a photograph of your family that he kept in his helmet. He'd look at it every night before sleep. One night I asked him what he was thinking. He said, I'm thinking about Sunday dinners when I get home. My mother's kitchen, my father laughing, the way my brother always steals the best piece of pie. He said, I'm thinking about home, sir, and that's worth fighting for. The old man let out a sob. He remembered the pie. He remembered everything, General Collier said gently, and he died trying to protect it. Your brother was a hero, not just because of how he died, but because of why he fought. He fought for family, for community, for the America he believed in. The two old men stood there, hands clasped, connected across 80 years. Finally, General Collier released his hand and addressed everyone. Remember this day. Remember how you felt when you realized you'd misjudged someone. Let that feeling guide you to be better. That's how you honor the sacrifice of the greatest generation. Not with parades or monuments, though those have their place, but with how you treat each other every single day. He walked to his car, Webb beside him. As he reached the door, he turned back. One more thing. When you go home today, if you have elderly parents or grandparents, call them, visit them, listen to their stories, because someday soon they'll be gone, and those stories will be lost forever. Don't wait until it's too late. He got into his car, the engine starting with a reliable rumble. As he backed out, the crowd remained at attention. Some saluted, others had hands over hearts. All of them were changed. As the Buick disappeared into traffic, Patterson turned to his employees. "Meeting in 15 minutes. We're going to talk about what just happened and how we're going to be better." Tyler looked at Martinez. "Can you send me that video when you post it? I want everyone to learn what I learned today." "I will," Martinez promised, "and I'm going to make sure the lesson comes through." 3 months later, Major General James Collier passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was laid to rest beside Margaret with full military honors. Hundreds attended, veterans, politicians, family, and strangers who'd heard his story. Among the attendees were Patterson, Cayley, Webb, the VFW widow, Richard Porter's brother, and Tyler Henderson. They'd been invited by the family, who'd learned about Morrison's from the video that reached 50 million views. At the funeral, the family displayed Margaret's ration book alongside the General's Medal of Honor. A placard explained, "This book represents the sacrifice of a generation. May we never forget." And across America, in stores and schools and homes, people continued to share the story of the general who tested humanity and showed a path toward being better. His lesson lived on. If this story reminded you to look beyond appearances and honor those who served, take a moment to think about the veterans and elderly people in your life who deserve recognition. Share a memory of someone who taught you about sacrifice. Tell their stories so they're never forgotten. And subscribe to hear more stories that remind us never to forget the shoulders we stand on, because the greatest generation is almost gone, and soon their lessons will live only in the stories we tell. Remember, every person you meet might be carrying a burden you can't see, a history you don't know, a sacrifice you haven't honored. Treat everyone with the dignity they deserve. That's how we honor those who came before us. That's how we build the America they fought for. Remember, honor, carry forward.